I grade pretty much all modern genre TV and film on a curve these days. Sci-fi, fantasy, action, adventure. I'm not really even sure what the last movie or TV show was that really felt inspired to me or has gone on to my favorites list. So that being said, Willow is not a masterpiece or even a great show. The sets are all flatly green screened. The character of Jade is awful. Kit and occasionally some of the other characters veer too far into modern, snarky, dismissive comic relief line delivery. And I know the budget probably wasn't enormous or anything, but they need to come up with a few more interesting set pieces and creatures, even though I know it's canceled, but whatever, my later points apply. Side note, stop using the words seriously and really as punchlines. They're not jokes. They're just dull responses. I feel like this is an extremely stale holdover from the Office era of comedy or something, but please stop. But those things aside, and taking into account that this is a Disney/Lucasfilm production, it does a lot of things really well and excels at a few of them. And specifically, I think that Willow, the TV show, is a better Star Wars thing than any of Disney's actual Star Wars things. Star Wars is classic adventure and fantasy. For some reason, either people don't want it to be or have completely forgotten. I think that there's a strain of the fandom that just wants to see their favorite characters interact and blow things up. Or this weird push from another segment of the fandom and some of the creators who feel this strong desire to legitimize Star Wars, i.e. Rian Johnson, who sees the simple lore of the original films as a problem that needs solving. This knee-jerk need to steer towards complexity for complexity's sake. Combine that with the more is more ADD-riddled filmmaking style of modern blockbusters, and you end up with the hollow shell that was Rise of Skywalker. I would argue that part of the problem, which began with The Force Awakens, is this odd tension between over-reverence for 70s and 80s nostalgia and the need to make $1 billion. Disney and Lucasfilm seem to think that fans only want the trappings of the original trilogy, the Millennium Falcon, lightsabers, Star Destroyers, familiar names, and maybe they're right. But either way, they certainly don't seem to care about what actually makes the originals tick on a fundamental filmmaking level. The mood and the atmosphere that the originals create beyond just the cool stuff in them. Other than some odd, decent moments here and there and the occasional attempt at original storytelling, Disney and current Lucasfilm are just giving us a conveyor belt of recognizable objects with little regard for the stuff that's supposed to glue them together, and that made them interesting and special to begin with. And that's all been fairly established by the criticism of these works over the last few years. We get it. I bring it up in regards to Willow, the TV show, for one reason. It's somehow managed to almost completely avoid this problem. Disney Plus Willow is almost totally nostalgia bait free because no one remembers Willow. It's probably not on many people's favorite movie list. The closest the show gets to member berries are Queen Bavmorda's ghost who shows up for 30 seconds and the occasional evocation of Mad Mardigan's ghost. There's no nostalgia to wallow in because no one cares, and it hugely benefits the show. The Netflix Dark Crystal series felt very similar in that regard, although much better executed. They didn't need to be anything. They weren't treading a minefield of expectations that ended up crippling the whole enterprise, whether it be too many cooks or an overly anxious production. The narrative didn't need to be awkwardly shaped around the character of Willow Offgood like the legacy characters in the sequel trilogy, because no one gave a shit. He's more or less the same character who continued doing much the same as he ever did, trying to be a sorcerer. In fact, the story pulls off Last Jedi better than Last Jedi did because it just naturally followed the thread left open from the original movie. He was a beginner who got lucky, rode that success into a leadership position in his village, and then the seeds of doubt began to creep in over time. In the last episode of the series, his doubt reaches critical mass, but before and after that, he is fundamentally heroic. He has an arc that's a natural extension of what we've seen of him, which brings me to actual discernible character arcs and growth. What a concept. You know what made me audibly go, yay, while watching the show? It was when Elora Danan is trying to use magic for the first time to make a plant grow. I can't even begin to describe to you how satisfying it was just to see a protagonist start out as an absolute beginner. Luke Skywalker in A New Hope. Yeah, he was whiny, but it was fun to imagine how and where someone so powerless would eventually find their voice. That's the joy of fiction. Borman, the mercenary dude, he's a cocky rogue. Doubt eventually creeps in as he is unable to make the chess piece thingamabob work, but then he finds personal resolve and escapes his selfish tendencies for the greater good, just like Han. Graydon, the Grand Budapest Hotel guy, he's a royal wimp in an arranged marriage who isn't given any credit from his detached father. He has a dark magic streak that occasionally hijacks his brain and once resulted in his brother's death. Over the course of the show, he slowly gains confidence and self-respect and starts his own path as a wizard. Kit, she's a stuck-up royal brat who learns to become less self-absorbed and care more deeply about the good of the group, being a hero as opposed to playing at one. All of these are simple, easy to follow, and satisfying progressions that make us feel like we've spent more time with these characters than we actually have. It's just something that's wired into the human brain to enjoy. 2022 Willow is also, refreshingly, not afraid to embrace basic-ass adventure and fantasy tropes. I love me some Lord of the Rings trilogy, and I understand people's enjoyment of Game of Thrones as they're basically the only live-action high fantasy that isn't goofy. And I understand that they reinvigorated and gave new life to a perpetually stale film/TV genre, but they also kind of ruined fantasy adventure at the same time. The problem is that they've brought upon us this curse of trying to make everything else prestige as well. Everyone seems to be desperately racing to legitimize nerd genres. Superhero movies, high fantasy, space fantasy, basically any legacy franchise. God, am I sick of the words franchise and legacy. And so, more often than not, we end up with joyless slogs and live-action adaptations that refuse to laugh at themselves because they're so desperate to extract every last drop of thematic depth that if they furrow their brow and clench their teeth hard enough, they can make the work transcend the inherent playfulness of its respective genre. Too much of Disney Star Wars thinks that simply removing tried and tested tropes, like the hero's journey, while rarely ever replacing them with anything, is somehow an improvement. A belief that those things are too cliché and therefore their removal matures the work. When the reality is that it takes a lot more courage to lean into and embrace whimsy and optimism at this point, because you have to make every element of the filmmaking and storytelling process work in harmony to pull it off. Making things dour and mature is now just a shorthand and an excuse. The visuals can be drab because the mood is drab. The characters can be depressing and drab because the mood is drab. The aspirations and motivations of the characters can be flat and dimensionless because the mood is drab. Maturity, complexity, and depth are just veneer buzzwords masking an adolescent crankiness. Willow strikes a good balance between serious and silly. It knows when to lean into emotional situations, but knows when to back off and embrace the absurdity of the genre. Again, though tonally more introspective and reflective, Fellowship of the Rings basically functioned in the same manner. It knew where to build tension and suspense, and it knew where to say, hey, look, some little people with large hairy feet are frolicking and singing songs. The protagonists in Willow are not in a weird state of sweaty Abrams-Whedon frenzy all the time, nor are they trashed on Ambien like characters in a Denis Villeneuve film. They have moods that adjust according to situations, because people are pretty effing bipolar. Beyond the well-executed individual characteristics, the show also manages to achieve real group camaraderie, something that every live-action Star Wars attempt outside of maybe the Han Solo movie has failed at miserably. Like charisma, camaraderie is that often hard-to-define, sweet melding of writing, directing, and good casting. At no point did I ever believe that Rey, Finn, Poe, or Luke had ever actually been in a room together. I could tell the actors liked each other, but that didn't really reflect itself in the characters' interactions. That's not really their fault. Obviously, the writing and direction has to glue their personalities together. In Willow, we get real, honest-to-God, actually funny bickering that's contextually and situationally relevant. We get characters who are well-defined enough that they naturally clash and bicker and have group dynamics that shift as the story progresses. Actors are allowed to act because the writer has given them chances to actually express what it is that they're thinking, and the director has given them the spaces to do so. Characters in the show smile and laugh and cry and are horny and have once. And that's where I'll finish it. So much of action, sci-fi, adventure, and fantasy have become more unreal than they've ever felt before because all the characters and situations in them feel so desperate to pretend that we're not all gassy goofballs who mostly like to eat, fuck, and scratch our junk. That's not to say that higher, loftier ideals or headier conceptualization can't be reached for. Of course, and they should. But the current state of live-action nerd culture wants to act like it can consistently escape the natural absurdity of imagination. Conformity through moodiness is getting really tiresome.